Hi there, grade sevens, and welcome to our Monday class. I'm so sorry that I can't be here, but we are still going to have our socials class today, even though it's going to be just a tiny bit different. Okay, so today we're going to talk or continue our talk about the Loyalist migration. We talked and you learned a little while back about how the influx of people during the Great Migration caused a few kind of issues. And today, what we're going to be focusing on are specifically those issues that were created by the so many people that were coming in and all the different groups and how they were interacting with each other and some of the problems that they had. So our focus today is going to be some of the impacts that were made on different groups of people because of the Loyalist migration. And not only are we going to focus on that, but we're also going to take a look at how different groups of people met the challenges that they were given during this time period. Now, the arrival of the Loyalists really increased the number of British people that were living in Quebec. Now, before the Loyalists arrived, Quebec had very few British settlers. But by around 1790, the British people actually made up about 10% of Quebec's population. The Loyalists started to ask Britain for British laws and British customs in Quebec because they were British-born subjects and they had always lived under the government and the laws of England, and so they wanted something that was familiar to them. Now, this ended up concerning some of the, well, actually, majority of the Canadians. You know, they had just gone through the Quebec Act of 1774 that had guaranteed them some rights. It was rights that protected their French laws and their French customs. And so their concern was, oh no, you know, we just had these rights protected with the Quebec Act, and now all of these new British people are coming. What's going to happen to these rights that we were guaranteed? Are we still going to have these rights, or are these rights now going to be endangered? And so that was something that was rather concerning for the Canadians. The loyalists that were coming up into the area, they were mostly farmers. And so their arrival ended up making a shift. Okay. And it was kind of a shift in the reason that Britain negotiated treaties or their agreements with the First Nations people. Now, before the Loyalists, Britain negotiated treaties of things like peace and friendship. So, for example, in 1779, Britain had a treaty with the Mi'kmaq people, and that treaty was to help secure their support during the American War of Independence. But after the Loyalists arrived, Britain started doing things a little bit differently. Britain negotiated treaties as a way to take over land in order to accommodate the settlers that were coming up. Now, between 1781 and 1792, Britain concluded some land treaties with the First Nations of the Niagara Peninsula. If you'll remember, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 required them to do this. Okay? Now, in territory, it had declared this Indian territory. Okay? And the proclamation recognized the First Nations' rights to the land. So the proclamation said First Nations had to agree to give up their land before the settlers were able to move in. The problem was, this didn't always end up happening. Now, one of the questions that we might have is, well, if they had negotiators between the British people and the First Nations people, did they really understand each other? Or were the differences that they had in languages and their culture, did those get in the way of the negotiations? Now, later on down the road, we will explore some more of these controversies with the treaty making. But when it comes to this particular situation, we can sort of think about what impacts would different languages and what impacts would different cultures have on those negotiations that were happening. Because if you remember, First Nations, they didn't think of the idea of owning the land. They didn't think that people could own the land. It was people could use the land, but it didn't belong to one particular person. And so that difference in and of itself made a huge impact on the way that the negotiations happened. A lot of the Loyalists ended up in Nova Scotia. And the thing with Nova Scotia is that it has very little amounts of good farmland. And so the families that made their ways there ended up struggling to make a living. And so as they were struggling and as they were trying to find ways to help support their family, they ended up moving into Mi'kmaq hunting and fishing grounds. Now, the British government didn't negotiate at all with the Mi'kmaq for these lands. It said that the Royal Proclamation of 1763 didn't apply to the Mi'kmaq people because they weren't within the territory that was described as Indian territory by the proclamation. So they tried to find a workaround for this whole situation. And they tried to say that, the Royal Proclamation really meant this, and it didn't include these groups of people in order for them to be able to get the land that they wanted. A lot of the Loyalists who arrived in Nova Scotia, they ended up joining settlements that already existed. So the British colonists in those settlements, they had migrated to Nova Scotia mostly from the 13 colonies after the 7 Years' War. They had taken over the land that the Acadians had once farmed. So Britain had deported the Acadians during the Great Deportation, which started in 1755. Now, a large group of Loyalists, they established new settlements right along the St. John River in what today we now know as New Brunswick. And these colonists felt very separated from the other colonists of Nova Scotia. They felt separate not only because of geography, but it was also because of the politics of the day. The St. John River settlers were mostly new colonists in Nova Scotia. And so they were unlike colonists in the older, more established British settlements. And they felt that they had different needs and different priorities than that group of people. So the St. John River colonists ended up petitioning Britain for their very own colony that was separate from Nova Scotia. In the late 1780s, the British government received several petitions from Loyalist settlers in Quebec. They ended up asking the British government to allow them to use British laws and British customs in place of the French laws and French customs that were there in place. Now, this meant that Britain had a problem. It owed something to the Loyalists that had fought with Britain against the Americans, but Britain also wanted to secure the goodwill of the new Loyalist settlers in case the Americans decided to attack what was left of British North America. Britain, however, had already passed the Quebec Act in 1774, which secured the support of the Canadians living in its colonies. So the question for Britain now was, how can we balance the demands of the Loyalists and the objective of Canadians to maintain their language and culture? How could we make sure that it's all able to exist all together? Because the Loyalist settlers around the St. John River, Britain divided Nova Scotia into several new colonies in 1784. It gave the St. John River settlers their very own colony, which we now call New Brunswick, and it also created the separate colonies of Cape Breton Island and St. John Island. Now, a few years later, Britain reorganized Quebec by passing the Constitutional Act in 1791. And this act ended up establishing British laws and institutions for the Loyalist settlers west of Montreal. And so what this act did was it divided Quebec into Upper Canada and Lower Canada. It established British civil and criminal law in Upper Canada, and then in Lower Canada, the act reaffirmed the arrangements under the Quebec Act of 1774. British criminal law, but French civil law. It also set aside lands for Protestant churches and guaranteed the Canadians the rights to the Catholic Church. It established officials and a legislative council appointed by Britain in each of the colonies, and an assembly elected by the colonists. So this meant that Upper and Lower Canada had what we call representative government. Now, representative government was an important right for the Canadians. Britain had promised to establish an elected assembly in Quebec under the Quebec Act in 1774, but if you recall, they had not followed through until this point in time. Representative government was also important to the Loyalists. So coming from the British 13 colonies, the Loyalists had long experience with representative government, and they actually considered it part of their heritage.